Presenting on Department of Medicine Unit 4. My topic of my presentation is who's the culprit, and my consultant in charge is Dr. Manna. Presenting 34-year-old Mrs. X from Jharkhand who had presented with complaints of generalized weakness for 2 years.
I think you're muted, Albin. We can hear you now, and we can see the screen.
So now, sir.
One second. Yeah, we can see the screen. You can, if you can go to presentation mode, otherwise just go ahead.
So can you see, sir, now? Is the screen seen, sir?
We can see the whole screen in terms of the PowerPoint editing panel as well. But just go ahead presenting, Albin. In the interest of time, we'll move ahead.
I think I'll present like this.
Like that,
Yeah.
but even that is not coming.
No, it's coming.
Then left.
Yeah, just go ahead, Albin. Thanks.
Yes. So my history, 34-year-old Mrs. X from Jharkhand who had presented with complaints of generalized weakness for 2 years, bilateral joint pains with early morning stiffness for 2 years, who developed high-grade fever for 7 months, and she also had a history of hair loss, photosensitivity, and other features suggestive of Raynaud's phenomenon. She was diagnosed as seronegative arthritis from outside and was treated with methotrexate and hydroxychloroquine initially, which she discontinued. She was started with treatment with steroids since April 2020 from outside, following which she had some improvement in the symptoms initially. She was also noted to have some cecal thickening and intra-abdominal lymphadenopathy and was empirically started on ATT before she presented to the CMC 15 days before. On examination, she was conscious and oriented on examination. Her pulse rate was 110 beats per minute regular. Her blood pressure was 100 by 70 millimeters of mercury. Her respiratory rate was 18 per minute. JVP was not elevated. She had a left axillary lymph node 2 into 2 centimeter, which was palpable. She also had tenderness present at the bilateral elbow and wrist. However, there was no swelling appreciated. And she also had some restricted movements of bilateral wrist. However, there were no deformities which is appreciated. Systemic examination, abdominal examination, she had a palpable liver of 2 centimeter below the left costal margin. Otherwise, there was no other organomegaly and there was no other mass was palpable. And she didn't have any shifting illness on examination. Other systemic examination was found to be within normal limits. So we had a syndrome complex of a 34-year-old lady who had presented with a fever, polyarthritis, generalized weakness, and features of alopecia, photosensitivity, and Raynaud's phenomenon. Differentials of main predominant differential one was a connective tissue disorder like a systemic lupus erythematosus, and another inflammatory arthritis, vasculitis, and an infection like a tuberculosis as she was initiated on steroids, following which she developed the fever, and other hematological malignancies were lower down differentials. Her investigation, she had a hemoglobin of 10.5. She had an anemia and total counts of 4,100. Platelets was 1.14 lakhs. Her liver function tests were found to be normal. The creatinine urea levels were normal and electrolytes were also found to be normal. Her ANA was found to be 3+ with a speckled pattern. Her dsDNA was found to be 900. She had low complements, low C3 and C4 she had. And her 24-hour urine protein quantification was 1,156. She also had an elevated LDH of 1,106 and also had a direct Cumstis 2+ positive. Her blood cultures were negative. Three blood cultures which were sent were negative, were evaluating for the cause of fever, and blood-borne virus screen was also negative. Her echo showed a mild pericardial effusion, and ultrasound abdomen showed a mild hepatomegaly. So one problem in her was that she was earlier diagnosed to have a TB, for which she was initiated on ATT treatment. So we had to rule out an infection and tuberculosis in her. A bone marrow was done, which showed a tri-lineage hematopoiesis. There was no abnormal cells. Expert TB was negative. As she was noted to have a cecal thickening, we did a colonoscopy and a segmental biopsy, which did not show any specific findings. As she was also noted to have a left axillary lymph node, the biopsy was done, which showed non-specific reactive changes, and expert TB was also negative. Her renal biopsy was done in view of the proteinuria that she presented with and which was suggestive of diffuse lupus nephritis stage 4. So our final diagnosis was a systemic lupus erythematosus with a class 4 lupus nephritis. So as she had a class 4 lupus nephritis with an SLE, we started her on, initially started her on hydroxychloroquine and 1 mg per kg steroids. And she was pulsed with injection methyl prednisolone 750 mg for 3 days and also received injection cyclophosphamide 700 mg with adequate prior and post hydration in view of class 4 lupus nephritis. Following which she developed the next day following the cyclophosphamide therapy, she developed sudden onset headache with blurring of vision, following which she developed one episode of generalized tonic-clonic seizures. On examination, she was found to be drowsy with a GCS of 14/15. Her blood pressures were found to be elevated. It was 190/110. Pupils were equally active and reacting to light, and there were no focal deficits on examination. An MRI brain was done, which showed a multiple near symmetric T2 weighted flare hyperintensities seen in both the posterior cerebral hemispheres, predominantly involving the gray-white matter junction in the parieto-occipital region and basal ganglia, with no diffusion restriction. So the features were suggestive of posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. So this was the MRI finding. So she had bilateral symmetrical, this is the T2 weighted imaging, which showed bilateral symmetrical hyperintensities in the posterior cerebral regions, the parieto-occipital region. And in the diffusion weighted sequences, it was like we could not find any findings in the diffusion weighted sequence. So going to the posterior reversible leukoencephalopathy syndrome, it was first described in 1996 by Hinchey in 2 SLE patients. It's a clinical syndrome of headache, confusion, decreased level of consciousness, visual changes and seizures associated with characteristic neuroimaging findings of posterior cerebral white matter edema. So the various conditions which are associated with the development of PRES are: one is blood pressure fluctuations and a hypertensive encephalopathy, patients with acute or chronic renal disease, patients on immunosuppressive or immunomodulatory drugs and chemotherapeutic drugs, patients with present with eclampsia, vasculitis phenomenon like an SLE associated vasculitis, polyarteritis nodosa, cryoglobulinemia, granulomatous with polyangiitis, and patients who undergone transplant, solid organ, bone marrow stem cell transplant who are on immunosuppression. So the various mechanisms which are associated with the development of posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome are: one is a failure of a cerebral auto-regulation during high blood pressures, causing a leakage of intravascular components, causing a hydrostatic vascular edema. There are other patients who do not present with severely elevated high blood pressures. An endothelial dysfunction possibly caused due to preeclampsia or cytotoxic therapies, causing a direct toxicity in vascular endothelium due to capillary leakage, and further vasogenic edema has also been described as a mechanism. The characteristic imaging findings are bilateral areas of white matter edema in the posterior cerebral hemispheres, particularly in the parieto-occipital region. Calcarine and paramedian parts of occipital lobe are usually spared, which distinguish it from the bilateral posterior cerebral infarctions. In the MRI scan, T2 weighted imaging and flare imaging, hyperintensities are seen, and diffusion weighted imaging shows iso or hypointensity, contrary to infarctions, which actually shows a hyperintensity in the diffusion weighted imaging. So the treatment involves, it's a reversible condition in most of the cases. Prompt identification of the PRES with the characteristic clinical presentation, and blood pressure control is the mainstay of treatment. In patients presenting with a malignant hypertension, 10 to 25% reduction of the blood pressure should be done the first 2 to 6 hours. Aggressive reduction of blood pressure should be avoided. The resolution of symptoms and findings on neuroimaging within days to weeks is seen with proper treatment. If the patients have been initiated on antiepileptic, it can be discontinued after resolution of the neuroimaging findings. So these are one case study, which is it's the first case series of 5 SLE patients with PRES in 2006 from Miami, where these patients, where most of the patients were SLE patients who received methyl prednisolone therapy and cyclophosphamide therapy. The patient presented with acute headache, change in the mental status, and seizures. The imaging showed white matter edema in the parietal and occipital lobes. They had complete reversal on control of blood pressures and supported treatment. So most of the patients presented with the characteristic symptoms and had exposure to high dose corticosteroids and cyclophosphamide. So it was described that PRES was a secondary complication of SLE or its treatment rather than the direct effect of the disease. So this is another study with the posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome in Korean patients. Yes, sir.
Can you wrap up in the interest of time?
Yes. There's another study which showed similar pictures, and renal failure was identified as a single independent risk factor in the multivariate analysis. So, in SLE patients, generally the most moderate to severe grade of disease, presence of lupus nephritis, usage of immunosuppressive therapy, high dose glucocorticosteroids, cyclophosphamide and MMF is associated with development of PRES, and recurrence is rare, however, seen in some circumstances. So our patient had an SLE with class 4 lupus nephritis, had pulse with methylprednisolone and had cyclophosphamide therapy. She had complete reversal of symptoms 2 days after control of blood pressures. Her repeat CT brain done after 1 week did not show any residual findings. So my learning points were identification of PRES in SLE patients presented with characteristic symptoms of headache, high blood pressure, visual disturbances, seizures and altered mental states in the appropriate clinical setting. And it's mostly seen as a secondary complication of SLE or as a complication of the treatment modalities rather than as a direct complication of the disease. And identification of risk factors which are associated with development of PRES, and it is a reversible condition and mainstay is the control of blood pressures. Thank you.
Albin, I have a question for you. In this patient, how would one, or in any patient with SLE, how would one differentiate neuropsychiatric versus steroid-induced versus PRES? Those would be your differentials when you see a situation like this.
Yes, so this patient did not actually have any when I went through different case studies, most of the cases have presented as patients who present with SLE and later they undergo treatment, and following the treatment they develop this symptom. That's when most of the cases have been diagnosed as a posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. Which they present with the characteristic findings, and they have resolution of the symptoms within on treatment of the blood pressures and resolution of the neuroimaging findings. The patients with SLE who present with neuropsychiatric manifestations generally does not have this rapid reversal of symptoms on treatment. So I think that is the differentiating factor which I found comparing these two patients.
Thanks, Albin. We'll go on to the last case. Rohan will present from Medicine 2. In the meantime, as Rohan is loading, would anyone have any questions to ask, any comments to make about either of the cases?
Good afternoon, everyone. The topic I've taken for today is called Sugar Rush. Actually, it's a comparison of two case scenarios and how we can apply the management of each of these patients in our daily OPDs or patients admitted in wards. So coming to case scenario number 1, I'm presenting Mr. S. He's a 48-year-old lorry driver. He presented with complaints of vomiting and fatigability. He's known diabetic for 6 years, on basal bolus insulin for 4 years. And as per the patient, he's compliant to medications. But further probing, he says that insulin was stored out.
We're not able to see your slides change. Can you just, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so coming to case scenario number 1, it's Mr. S, who's a 48-year-old lorry driver, present with complaints of vomiting, fatigability, who's a known diabetic for 6 years, on basal bolus insulin for the past 4 years. And as per his information given to us, he's compliant to the medications. And further probing, insulin was stored outside while traveling. When he goes on long trips, he doesn't have enough facilities to store the insulin correctly. So on examination, the patient was dehydrated. He was tachycardic, but otherwise vital signs were stable. Sugars at presentation were 503 milligrams per deciliter and HbA1c was 11.1. He did not have any micro or macrovascular complications on examination, and he was eventually diagnosed to have a diabetic ketoacidosis. He continued to require high dose of insulin in the ward, and considering his age and the history, given a possibility of latent adult latent autoimmune diabetes of the adults was considered. So his sugars were eventually controlled with high dose of insulin in the ward, and he was discharged on a basal bolus regimen plus metformin. So I'd like to pose a question. What would be his ideal treatment regimen for diabetes post discharge? Be answering that towards the end of the presentation. Coming to case scenario number 2, there's quite a contrast. Mr. P, he's an 81-year-old father of a staff in CMC who has good family and social support with complaints of fever, dysuria, cough, and breathlessness for 2 days. He's known diabetic and hypertensive for at least the past 10 years. He was diagnosed to have pyelonephritis, and during his stay, he was also found to have heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. He was treated with appropriate antibiotics, and his sugars were controlled with just a single oral antidiabetic drug. And he required minimal oxygen, which was tapered and stopped quite quickly. His HbA1c was found to be around 7.2. He had macrovascular complications of IHT and a microvascular complication of neuropathy. So in the same question I'd like to pose, what would be his ideal treatment regimen for diabetes post-discharge? I'd like to expand on this. Till 2018, till the 2019 guidelines given by ADA, they have not taken into consideration the cost of treatment or how a patient can afford it. So everything else is almost similar in all these guidelines. First line therapy would be metformin with, and if the patient has an high risk or established atherosclerotic cerebrovascular disease or chronic kidney disease or heart failure, they have recommended us to use different drugs for each condition. If there's increased ASCVD indicators of high risk, they'll ask us to start a second line GLP-1 or an SGLT2. If there's heart failure, to start an SGLT2 along with metformin. And if there's chronic kidney disease also, they've asked us to preferably start an SGLT2 inhibitor along with the metformin. But if there's no indicator as such, and if HbA1c is not under control as per an individualized value, then we have to consider these three scenarios. In our first main case, the issue is cost is a major issue and his storage facilities are limited. So compared to 2019 guidelines, they've changed and added this point which says we should consider adding these second line anti-diabetic drugs independent of their baseline A1C or an individualized A1C target or metformin use, because that is proven mortality benefits. So I'd like to expand briefly on the social determinants of health and diabetes. There's a lot of research that shows that diabetes affects racial and ethnic minority and low income populations. Social determinants of health are conditions in which people are born, which they live in and which they work in. These are influenced by distribution of money, power and resources. According to CDC, that's a definition given. I'd like to go point by point into each one of these briefly. So there's been a study done by Mr. M. Ratnavelu, which shows an increased prevalence of diabetes in the lower socioeconomic status as compared to an upper socioeconomic status group of people. In a sample size of 100, they've seen around 42 people in the lower socioeconomic group have an increased prevalence of diabetes as compared to only 7 in an upper socioeconomic group. So as regards to education, there's been studies showing the diabetes incidence is highest, is around 10.3 per 1,000 people for adults with less than a primary school education. And the prevalence and incidence decreases as their education is higher. I tried to include as many Indian studies as possible, but some of the data was not enough. So some Western studies also have included. Coming to occupation, there's a study done by Varanka Ruska, which is a meta-analysis of multiple population-based observational studies, which showed that there is an increased prevalence of type 2 diabetes among unemployed people as compared to diabetes in employed people with an odds ratio of 1.72. A significant association of unemployment with the prevalence of diabetes. Coming to housing and physical environment and food, as a study done by M. Vijay which shows that people who own a house, they've elicited this thing, this score called mean self-efficacy score, which is basically they ask patients whether how confident they are on following a diabetic treatment regimen, following taking the medications at the correct time, taking 3 meals and 3 snacks and other factors. So they've seen that people who own a house or are living with family with good social support are seen to have a higher self-efficacy score as compared to people who don't have a usual place to live or who rent a house. Uh, so in our patient first case also, he lives in a rented house and he does not have adequate storage facilities also for these insulin and his proper medications. And as it concerned with food affordability, patients often have to be put in a position where they have to choose between food or medications, and most of them are likely to go with food because that is a basic necessity, and they don't really consider diabetes and the complications as a important enough factor. Built environment is basically infrastructure, buildings in streets. There's a study done by Tuhig, Bennett Jones, which is also meta-analysis which compares incidence of type 2 diabetes in populations exposed to high green space and low green space. Green space is basically environments that have parks or any vacant land with greenery in it, where people can go walking. So they've seen in a population group that is exposed to higher green space has a decreased incidence of type 2 diabetes as compared to people who are exposed or live in a population environment with low green space with an total odds ratio of 0.72. So, and the major factor in all of this is the affordability of medical care and medicines. And there's a study done in by Chandra P. et al. In India among urban Indians, which looks at the economic burden of diabetes in a population group. So this also shows that a large percentage of lower socioeconomic group, people belong to lower socioeconomic group, a large percentage, almost 22% of their monthly income is spent on buying diabetic medications and treatment and visiting doctors, as compared to only around 1.32% in a higher socioeconomic group. So the main question here is whether we have to tightly control the sugars or relax control while taking into consideration the socioeconomic status of a patient. In case 1, as the question was posed, the ideal treatment regimen would be to start him on tab metformin 1 gram twice daily and on a basal bolus insulin regimen, which is what we discharged him with. But contradicting to that is his occupation and lack of storage facilities. We could give him a trial of, with practical application would be that we could give him a trial of metformin plus an SGLT2, sulfonylurea, which according to the ADA guidelines, if cost is an issue, you can start him on metformin plus sulfonylurea and give a long-acting basal insulin and review him in probably a month's time and see how he's coping with the medications and how he's whether he's been able to be compliant to the medications, as opposed to case 2, who's a father of a staff here and has good social support and can afford medications, who has a risk factor of ischemic heart disease. I would like to propose, as per the ADA guidelines, to start him on tab metformin 500 mg twice daily plus a SGLT2 inhibitor, which has proven mortality benefits for patients with IHD. We have discharged him on tab metformin alone, but since there's a proven benefit and he can afford the medication, we can start him on a secondary anti-diabetic medication like empagliflozin 10 mg once daily, which would decrease his risk factors for developing another, which would prolong the duration in which his ischemic heart disease can worsen. So the take-home points I'd like to give out is therapeutic management should be, as per all the studies that we've seen, should be individualized to each patient, and we should take into consideration their socioeconomic status and how practically viable the ideal regimen is for them. It may not be the case that ideal regimen is always viable, as seen in case 1, where we might have to make some exceptions and probably give the second best treatment, because that would be the treatment which he could be more compliant with. And I'd just like to brush up on the ADA 2021 algorithm regarding pharmaceutical management of diabetes. Thank you.
Thanks, Rohan. Rohan is an intern in M2. Compliment Rohan on taking the effort to present and reviewing this evidence. Any comments from Amit? Amit, please feel free to join in. In the meantime, Rohan, if you next and for all the registrars presenting, when you have a busy slide like in your guidelines, just
Yes,
ensure you break it up into small parts so that the person who's seeing it, whether it be their smartphone or on the computer, can see the area you want to focus on. So, Rohan, can you go to that last slide where you had ideal versus practical? Now, I just want to mention three things. You've got a context. You've got the treatment, which is here you're looking at the cost. And you also have to look at the consequence because
Yes, sir.
whether you choose ideal or practical, finally, the effect is what you want to look at. And you want to make sure that sugars are controlled. So that's one point. And here the practical actually seems quite ideal because here you have take insulin only once a day. You're actually taking tablets. Don't you think most patients would prefer the practical
Yes,
even
sir. Yes.
than the ideal?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
But thanks, Rohan, for making that presentation and for bringing up something interesting like this. Any comments, any questions? If not, we'll...
Hi, Rohan, this is Prithviraj, finally
Yes.
a medicine registrar. Just wanted to check if there is any guideline or recent trial that has actually shown a mortality benefit for SGLT2 inhibitors, because as far as I remember, nothing has shown a mortality benefit so far. It's only a composite cardiovascular outcome of hospitalization due to heart failure, which it is being considered as an endpoint. I don't think any mortality benefit has been shown yet, has it?
Yes, there's no study as such which I've come across which shows a mortality benefit, but just going by the ADA guidelines alone, they've recommended to add an SGLT2 which with the proven
Yeah,
level
that is true. That has
benefit
been
is
there
there.
since 2019, but the outcome has never been mortality. So it has been composite outcome of cardiovascular morbidity and hospitalization due to heart failure, which is a soft endpoint, which is why it has not become mainstream practice yet.
Okay, sir.
I guess it also depends on what your goal is. If you want to control sugars, choosing the drug might be reasonable if cost is not a constraint. May not change the outcome of death, but then sugar control is your goal here. Thanks, Prithvi, for that comment and question.
Thanks, sir.
One
Thank
more
you.
comment here.
Please go ahead, sir.
And I think that it was mentioned, just to reemphasize that when we have these patients, and if they're ready, if we can encourage them with a contextualized intensive lifestyle program, that may also help their medication regime requirements. In many places in the West, they are now using less and less sulfonylureas because they seem to accelerate beta cell fatigue and move them on after 4, 5, 6 years. We have to do what we have to do in our setting. So I'm not criticizing anything. I am agreeing with the presentation, but just in the back of our minds, where we can encourage them, even if we can't give them a big or an intensive lifestyle component, if we can think about lifestyle, or at least a small part of lifestyle that is emphasized at every visit, that in the long run may pay big dividends for the patient and their disease progression.
Thank you, sir. I think that's a very important comment. Sometimes we could keep looking at the cost of an intervention, thinking it's a drug, whether oral or injectable. Sometimes we don't look at the economic cost of an intervention, which is the doctor investing in the patient and motivating them to take better care of their disease. That's something you can't really cost, but definitely something which will change outcomes. Thank you, sir, for that comment. Okay, thank you for a good list of cases and all the discussion. See you next week for clinical meeting next Wednesday.
Yeah, would like to thank Dr. Tarun who chaired the session and all the four people who presented, including Dr. Rohan who's an intern and